The autumn wind carved through the frontier cemetery like a blade, carrying the scent of dying grass and the distant threat of winter. Ayana's breath came in sharp, terrified gasps as the sound grew closer, hoofbeats striking hard earth with the relentless rhythm of approaching death. Her small hands trembled uncontrollably as she clutched the ragged doll that had become her only anchor to a world that no longer made sense. Cold sweat beaded on her forehead despite the chill, and her heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird desperate to escape. The memory crashed through her mind, unbidden her mother's agonized scream, cutting through smoke and crackling flames. Men in dark coats dragging Elizabeth Morrison from their burning home, the terrible silence that followed the gunshots that ended everything good in her world. "I want to sleep with Mama," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind that seemed to carry the voices of the dead. Tears carved clean tracks down her dirt-streaked cheeks as she stared at the simple wooden cross marking her mother's grave, the earth beneath still dark and soft from recent digging. Wicasa felt the child's terror like a weight pressing against his scarred chest. His weathered face remained stone calm, despite the ice forming in his veins, one battle-hardened hand resting protectively on her thin shoulder. The jagged scar running from his left temple to his jaw caught the dying sunlight, a permanent reminder of the night he had failed to protect those he loved most. "Not yet, little one," he murmured, his voice carrying the musical cadence of his Lakota heritage, even when speaking English. "The world needs you strong tomorrow." The riders burst over the ridge like demons unleashed from hell itself. 8 men on foam-flecked horses with weapons gleaming in the fading light. Silas led them, his pale eyes scanning the graveyard with the cold patience of a predator who knew his prey had nowhere left to run. Behind him rode Beck's most vicious killer's men, who had long since traded their humanity for coin and the thrill of violence. "Now there they are." Silas's voice cracked across the evening air like a whip. The half-breed scout and his little pet, a rifle shot shattered the cemetery's peace, the bullet whining so close to Ayana's head that she felt the wind of its passage ruffle her hair. She screamed as Wicasa scooped her into his arms, his bullet-damaged leg protesting sharply as he ran toward the tree line. More shots followed, muzzle flashes blooming like deadly flowers in the gathering dusk. "Hold tight to me and don't look back," Wicasa commanded, plunging into the dense forest beyond the cemetery. Branches whipped at their faces as they crashed through underbrush, the sounds of pursuit crashing behind them like an avalanche of hatred and violence. Behind them, Silas's voice rose above the thundering hooves. $20 to the man who brings me the girl alive, 50 if you kill the Indian. 3 weeks earlier, when Elizabeth Morrison's homestead still stood proud against the endless prairie sky. Wicasa had been nothing more than a drifting scout, with no purpose beyond his next meal and his next drink. The Springfield rifle bullet that had shattered his right leg bone 2 years prior had ended his military service, but it had done nothing to ease the crushing weight of guilt that pressed down on his shoulders like stones from a collapsed mine. His wife Winona and their 7-year-old son Takala had died in a cavalry raid 5 years past, caught between armies that saw native families as obstacles to be cleared rather than people deserving protection. The official report had called it a regrettable incident during pursuit of hostile forces, but those bloodless words could never contain the enormity of what he had lost or his role in making it possible. He had been scouting for Colonel Morrison's detachment when the attack occurred, guiding blue-coated soldiers through territory his own people considered sacred. While he tracked phantom war parties across empty hills, masked raiders had descended on his isolated cabin like wolves on sleeping sheep. By the time he returned, there was nothing left but ashes, graves, and the terrible knowledge that his betrayal of his people had cost him everything that mattered. The column of black smoke rising from the Morrison homestead had drawn him away from tracking stolen cattle for a rancher near the Platte River. As he approached the burning farmstead, the acrid smell of destruction filled his nostrils. Charred wood-burned cloth and underneath it, all the sickly sweet stench of spilled blood that no amount of wind could carry away. By the time he arrived, flames had consumed most of the small farmhouse, leaving only the stone chimney standing like a grave marker among the smoldering ruins. He expected to find bodies, or perhaps nothing but ash, and the bitter taste of another family's tragedy. Instead, soft crying from beneath what had once been the kitchen floor led him to a root cellar, where miracles still occasionally happened. The heavy wooden door was partially covered by fallen beams, but when he managed to pry it open, he found a small girl huddled in the darkness. Her blue dress was torn and soot streaked her face, pale with shock, but she was blessedly, impossibly alive. Mama said to hide until the angels came. Ayanna had whispered when he reached down to lift her from the cellar, her trust in his scarred face complete and heartbreaking. Tears had carved the clean tracks through the soot on her cheeks. "Are you an angel?" Wicasa had looked at his weathered hands, felt the familiar ache in his bullet-shattered leg, and nearly laughed at the cruel irony. Angels didn't carry the stench of failure and betrayal that clung to him like smoke from a dying fire. Angels didn't lead armies to slaughter innocents, then arrive too late to save anyone who mattered. "No, child," he had said, gently lifting her from the darkness with infinite care. "But I'm here to help you now, and that's going to have to be enough." The men who had murdered Elizabeth Morrison worked for Jacob Beck, a land baron, whose empire stretched across half the territory like a cancer. Beck owned the largest ranch, controlled 2 lucrative mining operations, and kept territorial judges and sheriffs dancing to his tune through a combination of bribery, blackmail, and the occasional convenient death. He was the kind of man who would burn a homestead and kill a mother for a few hundred acres of good farmland, then sleep peacefully that same night. Taking Ayanna to the nearest settlement had seemed like the obvious solution until Sheriff Collins at Cedar Crossing showed sudden intense interest in Wicasa's whereabouts during the attack. The lawman's nervous fidgeting, carefully worded questions, and the way his hand kept drifting toward his sidearm made it painfully clear that Beck's influence reached further than most honest people realized. That first night, camping under stars that seemed cold and distant as chips of ice, Wicasa made a decision that would reshape both their lives forever. He would protect this child not because duty or honor demanded it, but because her survival might somehow balance the scales of his own devastating failures. In saving her, perhaps, he could find a path back to the man he had been before the weight of loss and guilt had nearly crushed his spirit entirely. As dawn broke gray and cheerless over the river valley where they had sheltered, Ayanna woke with fresh tears still wet on her cheeks and her small hands clenched into fists around her doll. "I dreamed about Mama again," she said in a voice no louder than a whisper. "She was calling for me, but there was so much fire and smoke I couldn't reach her. She kept calling my name over and over until the flames took her voice away." Wicasa knelt beside their dying campfire, studying the pain written in the child's young face like words carved in stone. Here was loss so fresh and raw it made his own 5-year-old grief feel ancient by comparison. Dreams of the dead visit us when our hearts are trying to understand what we've lost. He said softly, choosing his words with the care of a man who understood that careless speech could wound as deeply as any blade. "My people believe the spirits stay close until they know we can survive without them." "What happened to your family?" Ayanna asked with the direct curiosity of childhood, her blue eyes studying his scarred face with an intensity that made him feel exposed. "You look sad sometimes, like me, when I think about Mama and how she used to sing while she made breakfast." For a long moment, Wicasa was quiet, poking at the dying embers with a charred stick, while memories he usually kept buried clawed their way to the surface like creatures from a disturbed grave. "I had a wife named Winona," he said finally, his voice rough with emotion. "Her name meant firstborn daughter in my language, and she was the most beautiful woman in our band. I also had a son called Takala, which means standing bird. He was 7 years old with his mother's eyes and his grandfather's stubborn streak. He paused, watching sparks rise from the fire like tiny souls ascending to the star-scattered sky. They died because I wasn't there to protect them when bad men came in the night. I was off playing soldier for the white man's army, tracking shadows across empty hills while real enemies murdered my family in their sleep. Every day since I've carried the weight of that failure like stones in my chest. But you protected me, Ayanna said with fierce, childlike certainty. You saved me from the cellar and from the bad men who burned our house. Mama always said that doing one good thing doesn't erase one bad thing, but it plants a seed for something better to grow. Maybe saving me is your seed. Over the following days, as they traveled north through increasingly dangerous territory, their unlikely family began to grow in ways that surprised them all. The first addition came when they encountered Noden, a 16-year-old Lakota warrior, whose mentor had recently died of consumption, leaving the boy adrift between the traditional ways of his people and the harsh realities of a changing world. Noden was lean and quick, with intelligent dark eyes and the kind of restless energy that came from having too much courage and not enough experience to temper it. He carried a bow made from Osage orange wood and a quiver of arrows fletched with hawk feathers, but his most notable possession was a chip on his shoulder about the way his people had been treated by both the U.S. government and warriors like Wikasa, who had chosen to serve it. "Why do you help the white girl?" Noden demanded during their second evening, together his young voice, carrying both curiosity and the sharp edge of tribal loyalty that had been honed by years of watching his people suffer. Your own warriors call you turncoat for serving the bluecoats. Now you risk your life for a child who isn't even blood kin. What honor is there in that? Wikasa was quiet for a long moment, watching Ayanna practice loading the small Colt pocket revolver he had begun teaching her to use. Her small hands struggled with the mechanics of powder ball and percussion cap, but her determination was absolute and somehow heartbreaking to witness. Because she has no one else in this world, he said finally, his voice carrying the weight of hard-won wisdom. And because sometimes doing what's right matters more than what people call you afterward. My son would have been her age now if he had lived. Perhaps protecting her gives his death meaning, or perhaps I'm just a foolish old man trying to balance scales that can never be balanced. Noden nodded slowly, understanding beginning to dawn in his dark eyes like sunrise breaking over the prairie. The spirits move in circles, he said, using an old Lakota saying his grandmother had taught him. Maybe this is how they balance the scales of loss and redemption. Maybe your son's spirit guides you to protect this girl. Maybe, Wikasa agreed. Or maybe I'm just too stubborn to let another child die when I have the power to prevent it. Ruth Patterson joined them at her trading post, where two rivers converged in a tangle of cottonwoods, cattails, and fertile bottomland that had drawn settlers like herself to build lives in the wilderness. At 42, she possessed steel-gray hair, work-hardened hands, and the kind of quiet strength that came from surviving every hardship the frontier could offer without losing her essential decency. Her trading post had been partially burned by Beck's men the previous month, but she had rebuilt it with the methodical determination of a woman who refused to be driven from land she had earned through 20 years of backbreaking labor. The new construction still smelled of fresh pine and determination. Elizabeth Morrison wasn't just another settler trying to scratch out a living. Ruth told them as they shared a meal of venison stew, fresh cornbread, and coffee that actually deserved the name. She was organizing something much bigger and more dangerous than Beck realized, a network of people willing to stand up to his crimes no matter the cost. What kind of network? Wikasa asked, though, from the careful way Ruth chose her words, he suspected he already knew the answer. The kind that could have brought Beck's entire empire crashing down if he hadn't silenced her first. Ruth replied with grim satisfaction. Settlers whose land had been stolen, friendly tribes who'd been cheated in treaties, even some lawmen and judges who still had functioning consciences. Elizabeth called it building bridges, where others built walls. She believed different peoples could work together instead of fighting over the scraps that men like Beck threw them. That evening, as they prepared their bedrolls beside the gently flowing river, where fireflies danced like tiny lanterns among the willows, Ayanna approached Wicasa with the silver locket she always wore around her neck on a thin chain. "Mama gave me this the night before she died," she said, opening it with careful reverence to reveal a faded daguerreotype of a woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. She said it would keep her close to my heart always, no matter what happened to either of us. Wicasa studied the delicate piece of jewelry with growing interest. The mechanism seemed slightly too thick for just a photograph, and there were tiny scratches around the edges that suggested it had been opened and closed many times, with unusual care, not the casual handling of sentiment, but the purposeful manipulation of someone accessing a secret. "May I examine it more closely?" he asked gently, his scout's instincts telling him there was more to this simple keepsake than met the eye. The hidden compartment revealed itself when Wicasa's weathered fingers found a nearly invisible catch hidden beneath the photograph. Inside, folded smaller than a child's fingernail and pressed flat as paper could be made, was what appeared to be nothing more than innocent childhood artwork, flowers and birds rendered in colored pencil, with a kind of careful attention that spoke of hours spent in patient creation. But as Wicasa studied the drawing by flickering firelight, certain elements began to reveal their true purpose to eyes trained in military cartography. The flowers were actually compass roses, indicating precise directions. The birds marked specific distances and elevation changes with mathematical accuracy. What he held was a map disguised so cleverly that anyone finding it would dismiss it as nothing more than a sentimental keepsake from a loving mother to her daughter. "This isn't just a child's drawing," Ruth said, peering over his shoulder with growing excitement as she recognized what they had discovered. "Look at these markings. They're too precise, too purposeful. Your mother was a very clever woman, Ayanna." The revelation that struck Wicasa like a physical blow came when he compared the map's carefully coded landmarks to his own intimate knowledge of the territory. The location it indicated was in the Badlands, southeast of their current position on land that had once belonged to his family territory, that had been legally transferred to Beck after their deaths through documents Wicasa had never seen, never signed, and never authorized. "Your mother knew my family," he told Ayanna, his voice thick with recognition and dawning understanding of how deep this conspiracy truly ran. "This handwriting. I've seen it before in letters she wrote to my wife before the raid that killed them. They were working together to expose Beck's land frauds and illegal activities. The implications transformed their entire understanding of recent events, like lightning illuminating a landscape previously shrouded in darkness. Elizabeth Morrison hadn't been a random victim of Beck's expanding greed. She had been the architect of a growing alliance between displaced settlers and dispossessed Native Americans, a network that threatened the very foundation of his criminal empire. Her murder had been specifically designed to decapitate the resistance before it could grow strong enough to challenge his control. She hid something important where that map leads," Ruth said with growing certainty, her fingers tracing the coded symbols with the respect due to a dead woman's final gambit. "Evidence that could destroy Beck completely and restore justice to this territory. But getting to it won't be easy. That location is deep in the Badlands, and Beck's men will be watching every trail between here and there. Then we'll need allies." Wicasa decided, his military mind already calculating the odds and finding them discouragingly long. "More allies than just the three of us can possibly muster." What none of them realized as they made their plans around that flickering campfire was that their conversation was being watched from the darkness beyond the firelight. Ruth Patterson was not the woman she appeared to be, and the network Elizabeth Morrison had built contained a cancer that would soon threaten everything they hoped to accomplish. As dawn broke gray and cold 3 days later, painting the prairie grass in shades of silver and shadow, they began the delicate work of building the alliance that Elizabeth Morrison had envisioned before her death. Wikasa's first priority was reaching out to his uncle Chaitin, a respected war leader among the Lakota, who had been organizing his own resistance to Beck's increasingly bold attacks on tribal lands and treaty rights. The meeting took place in a hidden valley where a dozen traditional lodges clustered around a clear-running stream that had never known the touch of white man's pollution. Chaitin emerged from the largest teepee with the measured dignity of a man whose authority came from wisdom rather than mere force, his weathered face bearing the ritual scars of a warrior and the thoughtful lines of a leader who understood that some battles required more than weapons to win. "Nephew," Chaitin said formally, acknowledging Wikasa with the respect due to family despite their complicated history and the political difficulties his military service had created. "I have heard strange stories about your recent activities. They say you protect a white child and work with settlers against other whites. Some call this wisdom, others call it madness. The child is under my protection." Wikasa confirmed without apology, gesturing for Ayanna to step forward. She did so without fear, having learned through bitter experience to trust his judgment completely in matters of life and death. Her mother died trying to build bridges between our peoples. Now she carries evidence that could bring justice to all Beck has wronged red and white alike. Chaitin studied Ayanna with grave attention, taking in her steady gaze, her quiet courage, and the way she neither flinched from his scrutiny nor tried to hide behind Wikasa's protection. Here was a child who had seen the worst humanity could offer, and somehow retained her essential decency. "You show no fear of me, little one," he observed with something that might have been approval. "That speaks well of your spirit and of the man who protects you. Tell me, what do you know of my people's ways?" "War. Wikasa has been teaching me," Ayanna replied in her clear young voice. "He says the Lakota believe all things are connected, the earth, the sky, the animals, the people. When you hurt one part, you hurt the whole. I think that's why Mama tried to bring different people together. She knew we were all part of the same thing." A smile tugged at the corners of Chaitin's mouth, and the first genuine warmth Ayanna had seen from the stern war leader. "Wisdom beyond your years, child. Very well, you have my attention. Tell me about this evidence and why it matters to my people." Over the next hour, as the sun climbed higher and the morning mist burned off the valley floor, they explained Elizabeth Morrison's hidden cache and its potential to expose Beck's criminal network. Chaitin listened without interruption, occasionally asking pointed questions that demonstrated his strategic understanding of both warfare and politics. "Beck has stolen land from at least 6 tribal families through forged documents and fraudulent treaties," Chaitin said when they finished their explanation. "He has also bribed officials to ignore violations and illegal settlements on reservation land. If your evidence can prove these crimes in a white man's court, it could restore much of what we have lost and prevent future thefts. More than that," Ruth added, leaning forward with intense conviction, "it could break his entire criminal organization and free every community in the territory from his control. No more burned homesteads, no more murdered families, no more corrupt officials turning a blind eye to injustice." Chaitin was quiet for several minutes, weighing options with the careful consideration of a leader whose decisions affected hundreds of lives. The destiny of his people, the safety of countless families, and the future of the entire territory hung in the balance of what they decided in this hidden valley. "We will help," he decided finally, his voice carrying the authority of absolute commitment. "But this alliance must be built carefully, like a bridge across a raging river. Other tribes have suffered under Beck's crimes, but they may not trust working with whites, even those who claim to be friends. and many settlers fear all Indians, whether friendly or hostile. We must show both sides that cooperation serves their interests better than continued conflict. Over the following week, as autumn painted the prairie in shades of gold and scarlet messengers rode out from Chayton's camp to neighboring tribes and scattered homesteads throughout the territory, the response was mixed, but ultimately encouraging. Representatives from 4 different bands agreed to attend a secret council, while several settler families sent word that they would provide information supplies and safe houses for the growing resistance. The council convened in a natural amphitheater hidden deep in the hills, where towering sandstone walls provided both concealment and acoustic properties that allowed representatives to speak without shouting. Wicasa watched with growing amazement as groups that had been enemies for decades sat down together in a circle to plan Beck's downfall. "We need to know his movements at all times," said Tom Bradley, a grizzled settler whose farm had been burned out the previous month, leaving his family homeless and destitute. "Where his men are stationed, what routes they use when they're most vulnerable to attack or ambush. My warriors can provide that intelligence," offered Spotted Horse, leader of a Cheyenne band that had lost a valuable hunting grounds to Beck's illegal expansion. "We move unseen through country where white men thunder like buffalo herds. Their eyes see only what is obvious, we see everything. And we need safe places to hide refugees and supplies," added Mary Chen, whose Chinese laundry in Millfield had become an unofficial message center for families fleeing Beck's violence. Places where his spies cannot reach and his gold cannot corrupt. The planning continued for 2 days, creating a network of intelligence-gathering, supply distribution, and safe houses that stretched across hundreds of square miles. Maps were drawn, codes established, and contingency plans made for every scenario the participants could imagine. But even as they organized their resistance, disturbing news reached the council that cast a shadow over their efforts. David Molina, Ruth's trusted friend and a Mexican traitor who had been gathering information about Beck's operations, was found dead beside a remote trail 50 miles east of their location. The official story claimed bandits had killed him for his horse and trading goods, but the council members knew better. The resistance network had been penetrated, and Beck was beginning to strike back with surgical precision. "This changes everything," Ruth said grimly, as they discussed this latest tragedy around their carefully concealed fire. "Beck knows we're organizing against him. He won't wait for us to grow stronger. He'll try to crush us while we're still vulnerable." But even as she spoke these words of warning, Ruth Patterson was composing a very different message in her mind, one that would be delivered to Jacob Beck himself before the sun set on another day. The network Elizabeth Morrison had built with such care and sacrifice contained a serpent at its very heart. And that serpent was about to strike with venomous efficiency. That night, as the council members prepared to disperse to their homes and communities, carrying plans that could reshape the future of the territory, Silas struck without warning. The attack came just before dawn, when the natural amphitheater was still shrouded in morning mist that muffled sound and turned friends into phantoms. Ruth had volunteered for the early watch, claiming that dangerous work should fall to those who had chosen this fight willingly, rather than being thrust into it by circumstances. She was supposedly checking the perimeter when strong hands seized her from behind a cloth soaked in chloroform, clamping over her nose and mouth before she could cry out a warning. But what the others discovered when they woke to find her gone was not the aftermath of an abduction. It was the carefully staged scene of a woman who had walked willingly into the darkness to fulfill an obligation that had been eating at her soul for months. By the time they realized the truth, Silas and his men had vanished into the maze of canyons and hidden valleys that honeycombed the Badlands. They left behind only horse tracks pointing southeast and a message carved into the trunk of an ancient oak. "The woman dies at sunset unless the half-breed and the brat surrender themselves at Broken Ridge Mine." "It's obviously a trap," Noden said, stating what everyone already knew while his hands shook with barely controlled fury. "Silas wants to draw us into a killing ground where he has every advantage possible. Of course it's a trap. Wicasa replied grimly, checking his weapons with the methodical care of a man preparing for his own funeral. But Ruth saved my life once, and she's risked everything to help us build this alliance. We can't abandon her to Silas's tender mercies, no matter what the cost. What none of them suspected was that Ruth Patterson was not a victim at all, but the architect of her own capture. And the price of learning that truth would be paid in blood and betrayal before the sun set on what would become the longest day of their lives. The abandoned copper mine clung to the canyon wall like a festering wound in the red sandstone, its entrance dark and forbidding against the harsh landscape of the Badlands. Wicasa studied it through his military telescope, counting sentries and evaluating approaches while trying to ignore the sharp pain that shot through his bullet-damaged leg with every small movement. I count 8 men visible, probably more inside the mine workings themselves. He reported to the others, his voice tight with concentration and growing concern. Silas chose his position well, only one approach across open ground, with no cover for at least 100 yards. Anyone trying to reach that entrance will be caught in a crossfire, Noden his infected leg wound, making him pale and feverish. But his determination unshaken, pointed with a trembling hand toward a series of rock formations above the mine entrance. What about descending from above? Those cliffs might connect to the mine workings through old ventilation shafts or natural caves. Too dangerous for you in your condition, Chayton said after studying the treacherous terrain with an experienced eye. One misstep, one moment of weakness from your fever, and you'll bring the whole cliff face down on yourself. The mine is already unstable from years of blasting. Any additional shock could cause a complete collapse. But Ayanna had been listening intently to the sounds echoing from within the canyon. Not just voices, but something else that made her blood run cold with recognition and remembered terror. "Do you hear that?" She whispered, her small hand gripping Wicasa's arm with surprising strength. Someone screaming. They all fell silent, straining to catch the sound carried on the desert wind. When it came again, there was no mistaking Ruth's voice, crying out in pain and defiance, the sound echoing off the canyon walls like the wails of the damned. "Dear God." Chayton muttered, his weathered face creasing with genuine anguish. "Silas is already at work with his knives and hot irons. That woman won't last long under that kind of treatment. She's stronger than you think," Wicasa said, but his own voice carried doubt that he couldn't entirely suppress. "Ruth has survived 20 years on this frontier. She knows how to endure pain. Everyone has a breaking point." Chayton replied with the grim wisdom of a man who had seen torture used as both weapon and tool. And Silas is very skilled at finding those points quickly. As if summoned by their conversation, another scream echoed from the mine, longer this time, more desperate, carrying undertones of genuine agony that made Ayanna press her face against Wicasa's chest to muffle the sound. We're out of time." Wicasa decided, checking his weapons with movements made swift by desperate necessity. "Whatever we're going to do, it has to be now before she tells them everything she knows about our plans." The approach they chose combined stealth misdirection and desperate courage in equal measure. But it was Noden's deteriorating condition that forced them to adapt their strategy in ways that would prove both fortunate and nearly catastrophic. The young warrior's infected wound had worsened during their hard travel, leaving him feverish, weak, and increasingly unreliable in a crisis. "I can't make the climb," Noden admitted with the bitter honesty of someone facing his own limitations. "My leg feels like it's on fire, and my hands won't stop shaking. I'll be more liability than help in a confined space." "Then you'll create our distraction." Chayton decided, his tactical mind already adapting to circumstances. "Draw their attention while we attempt to reach Ruth through the cave system. But if things go badly, you retreat immediately. No heroic stands, no glorious deaths." Your duty is to survive and carry word of what happened here. The natural cave system that honeycombed the limestone beneath the mine was a nightmare of narrow passages, treacherous footing, and absolute darkness broken only by the flickering light of their single torch. Every step echoed, despite their best efforts at stealth, and loose stones clattered into unseen depths with sounds like breaking bones. Ayanna led the way, her child's size allowing her to navigate passages that would have trapped larger adults, while her memory of similar caves near her mother's homestead proved invaluable in reading the subtle signs that indicated which passages led deeper into the earth and which might connect to the mine workings above. This way, she whispered, squeezing through an opening barely wider than her own narrow shoulders. The air tastes different here, stale and smoky like the air in root cellars after they've been closed up too long. The sounds of torture grew progressively louder as they approached their destination. Ruth's voice hoarse from screaming, but still defiant in the face of whatever horrors Silas was inflicting upon her. Through a crack in the rock wall, they could see into the main chamber where Beck's lieutenant had established his gruesome workshop. Ruth was tied to a heavy wooden chair with leather straps that had been pulled tight enough to cut off circulation to her hands and feet. Her clothes were torn and bloody from knife cuts that decorated her arms and shoulders, like some obscene form of artistic expression. Silas stood beside her with a collection of tools that would have made a medieval torturer proud: knives, needles, small hammers, and several iron rods that glowed cherry red from their time in a portable brazier. "Tell me about the Chinese woman's message routes," Silas said in a conversational tone that was somehow more terrifying than shouting would have been. He selected a thin-bladed knife and drew it slowly across Ruth's forearm, opening a shallow cut that welled with bright blood. "Every contact, every safe house, every person who's helped your pathetic little rebellion. Give me that information, and I might allow you to die quickly when I'm finished." "I'll go straight to hell," Ruth gasped between gritted teeth, her face pale but her eyes still blazing with defiance. Silas smiled with genuine pleasure and reached for one of the glowing iron rods. "We have all day, Mrs. Patterson. And I have so many tools still to try." That was when several things happened almost simultaneously, creating the kind of chaos that either saves lives or ends them with equal efficiency. Noden's distraction began as planned, with the young warrior using his bow to pick off sentries from concealed positions among the rocks outside the mine. But his fever and weakness caused him to miss a shot that should have been easy, alerting Silas's remaining men to the attack earlier than intended. At the same moment, Wikasa's rifle butt smashed through the thin rock barrier that separated the cave system from the mine chamber, sending a shower of stone fragments across the room. The element of surprise lasted exactly long enough for him to fire twice, dropping the two guards who had been watching the torture with professional interest. But Silas was faster and more experienced than they had anticipated. Instead of diving for cover, he grabbed Ruth's chair and dragged it with him behind an overturned ore cart, using her body as a human shield, while he returned fire with a revolver in each hand. "You're too late," he called out, his voice carrying clearly over the thunderous gunfire that filled the confined space. "She's already told me everything I need to know. Names, locations, plans, your whole pathetic organization is finished. It was a lie designed to break their morale and make them careless. But in the heat of battle, lies could be as deadly as bullets." Wikasa felt doubt creep into his mind, even as he fought to keep Silas pinned down behind his improvised fortification. How long had Ruth been here? How much pain could anyone endure before their will to resist finally crumbled? That moment of hesitation nearly cost him his life, as one of Silas's surviving men managed to flank around to his right, using the maze of mining equipment as cover. Only Chayton's thrown knife, hurled with the deadly accuracy of 40 years' practice, saved Wikasa from a bullet in the back. But the effort left the war leader exposed to return fire, and a ricocheting bullet opened a gash across his shoulder that sent him stumbling backward into the shadows. The battle was turning against them when the mine began to shake, with the deep, ominous rumbling that miners learned to fear above all other sounds. Noden's distraction had involved more than just picking off sentries. The young warrior had used black powder stolen from Beck's own mining operations to blast the canyon walls above the mine entrance, hoping to create confusion and block any potential reinforcements. What he had not anticipated was that the mine support structure had been weakened by years of extraction and poor maintenance. The additional shock waves from his explosions triggered a progressive collapse that began in the upper levels and worked its way deeper into the earth with gathering momentum. Cave in. Someone screamed as dust and debris began raining from the ceiling in increasing quantities. The sound of cracking timber and shifting stone filled the air as the mine's support structures began to fail under stresses they had never been designed to bear. In the chaos that followed, with visibility reduced to mere feet and the air filled with choking dust, Ayanna did something that surprised everyone present, including herself. Instead of cowering in terror, as any sensible child would have done, she darted forward through the confusion, reaching Ruth's chair and beginning to cut the leather bonds with the sharp knife Wikasa had given her for emergencies. "Can you walk?" she asked urgently as the straps fell away, and feeling began returning to Ruth's hands and feet. "I can run if I have to," Ruth replied through teeth gritted against pain, her voice carrying a strange mixture of gratitude and what might have been guilt. "Get me out of here before this whole mountain comes down on our heads." But Silas had other plans that didn't include allowing any of them to escape alive. Emerging from his cover with blood streaming from a head wound and madness blazing in his pale eyes, he began firing both revolvers indiscriminately in their direction, caring nothing for his own safety or the structural damage his wild shots were causing to the mine's remaining supports. "If I can't have the information I need, I'll settle for killing all of you," he screamed, his voice barely audible over the sounds of progressive collapse. "Beck will reward me just as well for your corpses." His wild shots ricocheted off stone walls and metal equipment, creating a deadly storm of lead and rock fragments that filled the air like horizontal hail. One bullet grazed Ayanna's left arm, drawing blood and a cry of pain that cut through Wikasa's heart like a blade made of ice and fury. The rage that filled him then was older than civilization, deeper than rational thought, and more powerful than his own instinct for survival. This man had tortured an innocent woman, threatened everyone he had sworn to protect, and now drawn blood from the child who had become more precious to him than his own life. All the careful tactics and strategic thinking fell away, like autumn leaves, leaving only the primal fury of a father protecting his young. The fight that followed was savage, personal, and conducted in an environment that grew more dangerous with each passing second. Wikasa closed the distance between them in a rush that carried both men crashing into one of the mine's main support pillars, their impact causing a cascade of smaller collapses in the levels above. They fought with knives, fists, improvised weapons, and anything else that came to hand, while around them, the mine continued its inexorable journey toward complete structural failure. Silas was strong, experienced, and fighting with the desperate ferocity of a man who knew that defeat meant death. But Wikasa had advantages that his opponent couldn't match: superior training, absolute commitment to his cause, and the kind of focused rage that made men capable of impossible things. When Silas's blade opened a gash across his ribs, Wikasa barely felt the pain. When the bigger man's fist connected with his jaw, hard enough to loosen teeth, he simply spat blood and kept fighting. This was no longer about tactics or strategy. It was about survival justice, and the kind of primal combat that decided who lived and who died based on will rather than skill. The end came when a massive timber beam, weakened by the progressive collapse above, finally gave way and crashed down between them with enough force to split the solid rock floor. Silas looked up just in time to see several tons of stone and wood descending toward his head with the inexorable finality of divine judgment. His last words were lost in the thunderous crash that followed, but his expression of absolute terror and disbelief would remain burned into Wikasa's memory for the rest of his life. When the dust finally settled and the echoes of collapse faded into silence, they found themselves trapped in a section of the mine that was still structurally sound, but completely cut off from both the entrance and the cave system they had used to reach this place. Outside, they could hear Chayton and Noden calling their names, but tons of debris blocked every possible exit. "There," Ruth said weakly, pointing toward a narrow crack in the far wall, where fresh air stirred the settling dust. "Air's moving through that opening might be another way out, if we can make it wide enough." The passage was barely large enough for one person at a time, and it led upward at a steep angle that would have challenged healthy adults under the best of circumstances. But it was their only chance for survival, and they took it without hesitation or complaint. They emerged into blazing daylight through a hole in the canyon wall that looked like it had been torn open by some giant's angry fist. Below them, Chayton's warriors were working frantically to dig through the mine entrance, while smoke continued to rise from the wreckage of what had been Silas's stronghold. Uncle Wikasa called down to them, his voice hoarse from inhaling dust, but triumphant with the sound of impossible survival. "We're alive. Ruth is safe." The rescue took the better part of 3 hours, but when they were finally standing on solid ground with the desert sun warming their faces, there was no time for celebration or recovery. Smoke columns were rising from multiple points across the territory. Beck had declared open war on the resistance, and communities throughout the region were under coordinated attack. "He's trying to destroy the entire network before we can use Elizabeth's evidence against him," Ruth said, accepting medical attention for her wounds while studying the distant fires with growing alarm. "We have to reach that cache now before he figures out where it is and destroys it first." But as they prepared to race toward the Badlands location marked on Elizabeth Morrison's hidden map, none of them realized that their most dangerous enemy was not Jacob Beck or his army of hired killers. It was someone they had trusted completely, someone whose betrayal would cut deeper than any physical wound they had yet endured. The Box Canyon lay hidden in the red rock country, like a secret carved from stone in ancient shadow, its towering walls rising hundreds of feet on 3 sides to create a natural fortress that had sheltered peoples and purposes for countless generations. Petroglyphs decorated the sandstone surfaces, spirals, hunting scenes, and geometric patterns that spoke of cultures that had found sanctuary here long before white settlers ever dreamed of crossing the Great River. They approached at dawn, moving carefully through terrain that seemed designed by a malevolent god to break horses' legs and men's necks with equal efficiency. Recent autumn rains had turned the sandy ground treacherous, while loose stones made every step a potential avalanche that could alert enemies or cause fatal falls. But Elizabeth Morrison's disguised map proved accurate to the finest detail at the back of the canyon, protected by a natural stone arch that had weathered 10,000 years of storms. They found what they were looking for. The cache was far more extensive than any of them had dared hope. Metal strongboxes buried beneath carefully arranged stones contained not just documents, but also gold coins, jewelry, and other valuables that Beck had stolen over the years through fraud, extortion, and murder. Most importantly, there were detailed records that documented every crime, every bribe, every corruption that had built his empire of fear and greed. Sweet, merciful Jesus. Ruth breathed, studying a leather-bound ledger that listed payments to corrupt officials across 4 territories and 2 states. This isn't just evidence of his crimes. It's a complete organizational chart of his entire criminal network. Judges, sheriffs, territorial officials, even some federal marshals. Wikasa examined correspondence between Beck and government officials, his scarred face darkening as he recognized names of men he had once considered honorable. "Half the territorial government is in his pocket," he said grimly. "No wonder he's been able to operate with impunity for so long. Look at this." Ayanna said, her young voice tight with emotion as she held up a familiar piece of paper. "It's a letter from Mama to someone named William Harrison, telling him about Beck's crimes and asking for help." She signed it, "Your faithful correspondent, Elizabeth Morrison." Harrison. Chayton mused, the name sparking recognition. There's a federal marshal by that name who's been investigating territorial corruption. If Elizabeth was working with him, he might be the honest lawman we need to present this evidence. As they worked to catalog and organize the overwhelming amount of evidence, none of them noticed how Ruth Patterson had grown increasingly quiet and withdrawn. Her responses to questions became shorter, her movements more nervous, and she kept glancing toward the canyon entrance as if expecting something to happen. "We should divide this material," Ruth suggested, her voice carrying a strange tension. "Hide some of it in different locations so that if Beck finds one cache, he won't get everything." "No," Wakasa said firmly, his military instincts warning him against splitting their resources. "We keep it together and get it to honest authorities as quickly as possible. Every day we delay gives Beck more time to eliminate witnesses and destroy evidence." It was then that Nodin, who had been studying the canyon walls with the sharp eyes of a hunter, suddenly went very still. His fever had broken during their journey, and his infected wound was finally beginning to heal. But something he saw among the rocks above them made his blood run cold. "O Wakasa," he said quietly, his voice carrying a warning that made everyone stop what they were doing. "We're not alone here." The attack came with a kind of coordinated precision that spoke of careful planning and intimate knowledge of their movements. Jacob Beck himself appeared at the canyon entrance with 40 mounted men, their weapons gleaming in the morning sun, and their faces set with the grim determination of soldiers following orders they had been well paid to execute. But it was what happened next that transformed their desperate situation into something approaching betrayal and horror. Instead of taking defensive positions or preparing to fight their way out, Ruth Patterson stood up slowly and began walking toward Beck's position with her hands raised not in surrender, but in greeting. "Thank you for coming so quickly." She called out, her voice carrying clearly across the canyon floor. "I was beginning to worry that my message hadn't reached you in time." The words hit Wakasa like physical blows, each syllable driving deeper the terrible understanding of how completely they had been deceived. Ruth, the woman who had fed them, sheltered them, and apparently endured torture at Silas's hands, had been working for Beck all along. "Now," was all he managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. Ruth turned to face them, and for the first time since they had known her, her expression was completely open and honest, revealing depths of guilt and self-loathing that were almost too painful to witness. "My grandchildren," she said simply, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "Beck has my daughter's children in Kansas City. 2 little girls, ages 4 and 6. He promised to kill them slowly if I didn't cooperate, and I couldn't let that happen. I couldn't choose strangers over my own blood, no matter how good your cause might be." Beck dismounted with the casual confidence of a man who held all the advantages his expensive clothes and soft appearance belied by the cold intelligence in his eyes and the practiced way he handled his weapons. "Don't judge her too harshly," he said with mock sympathy, his voice carrying the kind of false concern that made honest people's skin crawl. "Family loyalty is such a powerful motivator. I've built half my empire on people's willingness to betray their principles to protect their loved ones." He gestured to his men, who began spreading through the canyon with military precision, taking positions that would prevent any escape, while others started gathering wood for fires that would consume Elizabeth Morrison's evidence, along with anyone who had seen it. "I have to admit, you've been more troublesome than I anticipated." Beck continued addressing Wakasa directly while his men worked. "When Ruth first reported that the Morrison brat had survived the fire, I thought it would be a simple matter to track you down and eliminate the problem. I never expected you to uncover Elizabeth's little treasure trove or organize such an effective resistance. Your mistake was underestimating the power of people working together for justice." Wakasa replied, his hand moving slowly toward his knife, while he calculated distances and angles of attack. Justice. Beck laughed, a sound devoid of humor or humanity. This territory doesn't need justice. It needs order, progress, and the kind of strong leadership that men like me can provide. Your wife and son learned that lesson, didn't they? What were their names? Winona and Takala. The casual mention of his murdered family's names sent a wave of rage through Wikasa that was almost overwhelming in its intensity. But he forced himself to remain calm and focused. This was exactly the kind of emotional reaction. Beck wanted, something that would make him careless and vulnerable. I remember them quite clearly. Beck continued with deliberate cruelty. Pretty little wife, curious little boy. They were asking too many questions about my land acquisitions, writing letters to people who might have caused problems for my operations. Elizabeth Morrison wasn't the first bleeding heart to try organizing resistance against me. So you had them murdered, Wikasa said, his voice carrying the cold finality of absolute judgment. I solved a business problem, Beck corrected with the tone of a man explaining something obvious to a slow child. Just like I'm about to solve the problem you've created. The only question is whether you want to die quickly or slowly. I can be merciful to men who show proper respect. That was when the canyon began to echo, with sounds that made Beck's confident expression falter, and his men looked nervously toward the rim high above them. War cries in the Lakota language, amplified by the natural acoustics of the stone walls, announced the arrival of Chayton's warriors, as they descended on ropes from positions they had taken during the night. The battle that followed would be remembered in tribal stories for generations to come. A testament to what could be accomplished when different peoples united against a common enemy. Beck's hired guns were professionals who fought for money and respected nothing but superior firepower, but they found themselves facing warriors who fought for their families, their lands, and their very survival as a people. Arrows fell like deadly rain from the canyon walls, while rifle fire echoed off the sandstone with thunderous reverberations that seemed to shake the earth itself. The confined space worked against Beck's superior numbers, forcing his men to bunch together and making them vulnerable to the kind of concentrated fire that Chayton's warriors delivered with deadly accuracy. But it was in the narrow space near the evidence cache that the most important battle took place, a personal confrontation between two men who represented everything the other despised about the changing West. Wikasa and Beck faced each other among the scattered strongboxes and papers that contained the power to reshape the territory's future. Beck was larger, stronger, and had lived a life of comfort that should have made him soft. But there was nothing soft about the way he moved or the cold calculation in his eyes as he drew a knife with an 8-inch blade and advanced on his opponent. You think this changes anything? He said, gesturing with the weapon toward the battle raging around them. Kill me, and there are others who will take my place. Men with vision who understand that this territory needs to be tamed by those strong enough to hold it. And the territory needs justice. Wikasa replied, drawing his own blade, a traditional Lakota knife that had belonged to his father and his father's father. And you're not going to prevent that anymore. Their fight was brutal, personal, and conducted with the kind of focused intensity that came from years of mutual hatred, finally given expression. Beck fought with the desperate ferocity of a man who had everything to lose, while Wikasa carried the accumulated fury of 5 years' grief and the absolute determination to protect everything he had come to love. They crashed through mining equipment and scattered documents, their battle ranging across the canyon floor, while around them the larger conflict continued to rage. Beck's blade opened wounds on Wikasa's arms and shoulders, but the warrior's superior training and experience began to tell as the fight continued. The crucial moment came when Beck, desperate and increasingly off balance, made a grab for one of the strongboxes, not to use as a weapon, but to hurl it into the fire his men had built to destroy the evidence. His obsession with eliminating the proof of his crimes made him careless, and Wikasa's knife found its mark between his ribs with surgical precision. Jacob Beck died as he had lived surrounded by the wealth he had stolen, and the documents that recorded his crimes, his life's blood, mixing with the desert sand, while justice finally caught up with the man who had thought himself above any law. As the sounds of battle began to fade and Beck's surviving men threw down their weapons in surrender, the canyon filled with an almost supernatural quiet. The morning sun, climbing toward its zenith, illuminated a scene of victory that had come at a terrible cost in blood and betrayal. But even as they began to count their dead and tend their wounded, the sound of approaching cavalry announced that their struggles were far from over. Federal troops were riding hard toward the canyon, and with them came a man whose arrival would change everything once again. Marshal William Harrison, the real one. Not the imposter who had betrayed them earlier, rode into the canyon at the head of a full cavalry troop, his weathered face showing both relief and determination as he surveyed the aftermath of the battle. Jacob Beck. He called out, then stopped as he saw the land baron's body lying among the scattered evidence. "Well, I suppose that saves the territory the cost of a trial. Is this all of it?" he asked, gesturing toward the strong boxes and documents that Elizabeth Morrison had died protecting. "Every crime, every bribe, every murder." Wikasa confirmed, his voice hoarse from battle and emotion. "Enough evidence to clean out corruption from here to Washington, D.C. Harrison's face lit up with grim satisfaction as he began examining the materials they had recovered. "We've been trying to build a case against Beck's organization for 2 years, he said. "This will let us root out corruption at every level of government and restore honest law enforcement to the territory." But there was one more piece of business to conclude before justice could truly be served. Ruth Patterson stood apart from the others, her face showing the complex mixture of relief and guilt that came from surviving betrayal of one's own principles. "What happens to her?" Ayanna asked, her young voice carrying a wisdom beyond her years. Harrison studied Ruth for a long moment, weighing legal requirements against the reality of her situation. "Her cooperation was coerced through threats against her family," he said finally. "Under territorial law, that's a mitigating circumstance. She'll face charges, but given her testimony and the intelligence she can provide about Beck's remaining network, I expect she'll receive clemency." As the federal troops began the process of collecting evidence and preparing for the journey back to the territorial capital, Wikasa found himself standing beside Elizabeth Morrison's daughter, watching justice finally begin to unfold in the land where her mother had lived and died. "Is it over?" Ayanna asked, her small hand finding his scarred one. "This part is, Wikasa replied, thinking of all the work that lay ahead, the trials, the investigations, the slow process of rebuilding communities that had been torn apart by years of corruption and violence. But your mother's dream of bringing different peoples together is just beginning to come true." 6 months after the battle in the canyon, the territorial capital hummed with activity as the largest corruption trial in the region's history unfolded in a courthouse, packed with settlers, Native Americans, and townspeople who had come to witness justice finally being served. The evidence recovered from Elizabeth Morrison's cache had proven even more damaging than anyone had anticipated, revealing a network of corruption that reached from local sheriffs all the way to officials in Washington, D.C. Judge Morrison, no relation to Ayanna's mother, but a man who had dedicated his career to fighting the kind of corruption that had destroyed so many innocent lives, presided over proceedings that would reshape the political landscape of the entire territory. His courtroom had become a symbol of the new order that was emerging from the ashes of Beck's criminal empire. The evidence presented to this court, Judge Morrison declared on the final day of the main trial, his voice carrying the weight of absolute moral authority, reveals a criminal conspiracy of unprecedented scope and ruthlessness. Land stolen through forgery and fraud, officials corrupted through systematic bribery, Innocent families murdered to silence their testimony against powerful criminals. This tribunal finds the defendants guilty on all charges. The sentences were swift, severe, and absolutely final. Beck's surviving lieutenants faced either long prison terms or the gallows, depending on their specific crimes. Corrupt officials lost their positions, their freedom, and in many cases, their lives. Most importantly, the legal framework that had enabled such widespread criminality was dismantled and replaced with laws that protected all citizens equally regardless of their race background or economic status. Tom Bradley took the witness stand early in the proceedings, his weather-beaten hands shaking as he placed them on the Bible to swear his oath. His testimony about the Johnson family massacre was delivered in a voice that cracked with emotion, but never wavered in its clarity. I was riding past their homestead just after sunset when I heard gunshots. He said, pointing directly at 3 defendants who had worked for Beck's organization. When I got closer, I saw men in dark coats setting fire to the house. The whole family was already dead, John, Mary, even their 2 little ones who couldn't have been more than 5 and 7 years old. Similar testimony came from dozens of witnesses who had finally found the courage to speak truth about the horrors they had witnessed. Miguel Santos described how his family's ranch had been stolen through forged documents and threats of violence. Mary Chen told how her laundry business had been used as an intelligence center under constant threat of death for her children. But it was Ayanna Morrison herself who provided the most powerful testimony of all. Now 13 years old and poised beyond her years, she took the stand wearing a simple blue dress and her mother's silver locket, her clear voice carrying to every corner of the packed courtroom. Mama always said there were wolves dressed like men in this world. She said, looking directly at the remaining defendants with a kind of steady gaze that made grown men uncomfortable. She said that good people had to stand up to those wolves, even when it was dangerous, even when it cost them everything they had. I think that's what she was doing when they killed her, standing up for what was right. She paused, her young voice growing stronger as she continued. But Mama also taught me that wolves can only hurt you if good people don't work together. She showed me that different kinds of people, settlers and Indians, rich and poor, young and old, could build something better if they just tried to understand each other instead of fighting. The courtroom was absolutely silent as she concluded her testimony, her words carrying a moral weight that no adult argument could match. The verdicts and sentences that followed were unanimous and merciless. Justice, so long delayed, finally arrived with the force of divine retribution. But beyond the punishment of the guilty, the trials accomplished something even more important. They established legal precedents that would protect future generations from similar corruption and violence. Land that had been stolen through fraud was systematically returned to its rightful owners. Miguel Santos received clear title to his family's ranch, along with compensation for the years of lost income. Native American tribes received not only restoration of illegally seized territory, but also reparations for treaty violations and the establishment of legal protections that would be far more difficult for future criminals to circumvent. Most significantly, Wikesa was formally granted ownership of the territory where his wife and son were buried, land that would remain in Lakota hands under the protection of federal law. Standing on that familiar prairie ground for the first time as its legal owner, he felt the weight of 5 years' grief finally beginning to lift from his shoulders. The execution of Beck's surviving conspirators took place on a crisp morning in late autumn, with hundreds of witnesses gathering in the town square to see justice finally served. Ayanna chose not to attend, but Wikasa stood among the crowd as the trapdoors fell, and the men who had murdered so many innocents paid the ultimate price for their crimes. Ruth Patterson was not among those executed. Her cooperation with Beck had been coerced rather than voluntary, and her testimony had proven crucial in exposing the full extent of the criminal network. Instead, she faced exile from the territory and the loss of everything she had built over 20 years of frontier life. As she prepared to leave for California, where distant relatives had agreed to take her in, She sought out Wicasa and Ayana one final time. The meeting took place at Elizabeth Morrison's grave, which had been transformed from a simple frontier burial into a memorial garden where people from across the territory came to honor those who had died fighting for justice. "I know you can't forgive me," Ruth said, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks as she knelt to place wildflowers on the grave. "But I want you to understand why I did what I did. Beck had my grandchildren, 2 little girls no older than Ayana was when her mother died. He showed me photographs of them, told me exactly how he would kill them if I didn't cooperate. I couldn't choose principles over their lives, no matter how right your cause was." Wicasa studied her face, seeing the genuine anguish there and recognizing the impossible choice she had been forced to make. "You were a mother protecting her young," he said finally, his voice carrying understanding rather than condemnation. "I can't say I forgive you, but I understand why you did it. In your place, facing the same choice, I might have done the same thing. Will you tell people that someday?" Ruth asked, her voice breaking with the weight of her guilt and shame. "When enough time has passed and the anger has faded, will you remember that I tried to do good even when I failed so terribly?" "I'll remember," Ayana promised, showing wisdom far beyond her 13 years. "Mama always said people were complicated, that good people sometimes did bad things for good reasons. She would have understood your choice, even if she couldn't have made it herself." As Ruth's wagon disappeared into the distance, carrying her toward an uncertain future in a place where no one knew her history, Ayana and Wicasa stood together in the memorial garden, surrounded by the evidence of how much their world had changed. The transformation of the territory over the following year was nothing short of miraculous. Communities that had lived in fear began to flourish as honest law enforcement replaced Beck's reign of terror. New settlements were established by people seeking opportunity rather than exploitation, while existing towns expanded as trade and commerce returned to normal patterns. The railroad finally arrived, bringing with it connection to the wider world, without the destructive impact that many had feared. Telegraph lines followed, carrying news and messages that helped keep scattered communities in touch with each other and with the outside world. Most importantly, schools and churches were built in every settlement, creating institutions that would preserve the hard-won lessons of cooperation and justice for future generations. But perhaps the most significant change was in the relationships between different peoples who had learned to work together during the struggle against Beck's tyranny. The alliance between native tribes and settler communities, forged in blood and betrayal, evolved into something more permanent and more powerful than anyone had originally envisioned. Chayton was elected to represent tribal interests in the new territorial government, working alongside officials from settler communities to craft laws that protected everyone fairly. The old war leader had become a statesman, proving that wisdom and diplomacy could accomplish what violence never could. Noden fully recovered from his wound and, recognized as a warrior among his people, established a school where young Lakota learned both traditional skills and the knowledge they would need to navigate an increasingly complex world. He walked with a slight limp that served as a constant reminder of his role in bringing down Beck's empire, but he wore it as a badge of honor rather than a disability. 1 year after the battle in the canyon, as spring brought new life to the prairie grasslands, a ceremony was held at the memorial garden that had grown around Elizabeth Morrison's grave. What had begun as a simple frontier burial had evolved into a gathering place where people from across the territory came to remember those who had died fighting for justice and to renew their commitment to the principles for which they had sacrificed so much. Ayana, now 14, and no longer the frightened child who had hidden in a root cellar, stood before a crowd of several hundred people to deliver the dedication speech for a new monument that would honor all the victims of Beck's reign of terror. "My mama always believed that different people could work together if they just tried to understand each other instead of focusing on their differences." She began, her voice clear and confident as it carried across the assembled crowd. She said the only way to stop the wolves was for good people to stand together, no matter what they looked like, or where they came from, or what language they spoke at home. She gestured toward the monument, a simple stone pillar inscribed with the names of everyone who had died fighting Beck's corruption. Both native and white, young and old men and women who had given their lives so that others might live in freedom. This place reminds us that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they work together for something bigger than themselves. She continued her words, carrying the moral weight that came from having lived through the experiences she described. My mama's dream of building bridges instead of walls has become real in this territory, but only because people were willing to sacrifice for it. She paused, looking out at faces that represented every community in the region. Lakota and Cheyenne warriors standing beside white settlers, Mexican ranchers next to Chinese merchants, children of every background, listening to words that would shape their understanding of what it meant to be citizens of a just society. But the work isn't finished. Ayanna concluded, her voice growing stronger as she reached the heart of her message. Every generation has to choose whether they'll build bridges or walls, whether they'll stand together against the wolves or let fear divide them. That's our responsibility now, to make sure that what happened here never happens again anywhere. The ceremony concluded with the dedication of a new school that would serve children from multiple communities, teaching them together regardless of their backgrounds, in classrooms where cooperation and mutual respect were fundamental parts of the curriculum. Ayanna had been chosen as one of the first students, but she also helped teach younger children the lessons she had learned about courage, justice, and the power of people working together for the common good. Later that evening, as the crowds dispersed to their homes and ranches throughout the territory, Wikasa found himself standing beside the graves of his wife and son. New headstones marked their resting places, carved granite monuments that honored their memory with both English and Lakota inscriptions, symbols of the blended culture that was emerging in the transformed territory. Ayanna joined him there, carrying wildflowers she had picked from the memorial garden to place on each grave, with the reverent care of someone who understood the weight of loss and the power of memory. "Do you think they would be proud of what we've accomplished?" she asked, gesturing toward the lights of the growing settlement that spread across the valley below them. Wikasa smiled, feeling a peace he hadn't known since the day his family died. The old guilt and self-recrimination had been replaced by something better. The knowledge that their deaths had not been meaningless, that good could emerge even from the darkest tragedies. "I think they would be amazed," he said, his voice carrying the quiet satisfaction of a man who had found his way back from the edge of despair. "When I lost them, I thought my life was over, that I would never find purpose or hope again. I never imagined I could build a new family, or that protecting one frightened child could lead to saving an entire territory. Mama used to say that endings were just beginnings in disguise." Ayanna replied, understanding flowing between them with the ease of people who had shared the worst and best that life could offer. "Maybe losing your family was what prepared you to save me, and saving me led to saving everyone else. Maybe that's how the spirits work. They make sure that love never really dies. It just finds new ways to grow." As they walked back toward the settlement, where warm lights glowed in windows and the sounds of evening meals drifted on the prairie wind, Wikasa reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this place of peace and belonging. He had begun as a broken man, carrying the weight of failure and loss. But in protecting one frightened child, he had found not just redemption, but a new understanding of what it meant to be truly strong. The territory around them continued to change and grow, moving steadily toward statehood, with a constitution that reflected the lessons learned during their struggle against corruption and tyranny. Communities prospered based on cooperation rather than conquest, and there was a sense of possibility in the air that had been entirely absent during the dark years of Beck's rule. In the years that followed, Wikasa would serve in many capacities: scout and translator, mediator and counselor, and occasionally warrior, when diplomacy failed to resolve conflicts peacefully. But his most important role would always be as the father who had kept faith with a frightened child when the world seemed darkest, and who had helped her become the strong, capable leader her mother had known she could be. At their home that evening, a comfortable house built with lumber, donated by grateful settlers, and decorated with artwork created by tribal artisans, they found a letter waiting from the new territorial governor. The message was brief but significant. Ayanna had been selected to represent the territory at a national education conference in Washington, D.C., where she would speak about the innovative schools that were bringing different communities together. Mama would have been so proud. Ayanna said, holding the letter with hands that trembled slightly with emotion. She always dreamed of seeing this kind of cooperation spread to other places. She would be proud of you, Wikasa corrected gently. You've become everything she hoped you would be: strong, compassionate, and committed to making the world better for everyone. That night, as Ayanna prepared for sleep in her own room, in a house where she was safe and loved, she opened the jewelry box where she kept her most precious possessions. The silver locket was there, but now it held new photographs alongside the faded image of Elizabeth Morrison, pictures of Wikasa and Chayton of Noden, and the other friends who had become her chosen family. The hidden compartment that had once concealed her mother's coded map now held a different kind of treasure. On the first page of a book, Ayanna was writing about their experiences, a story she hoped would teach future generations about the power of ordinary people to accomplish extraordinary things when they work together for justice. Dear children of tomorrow, she had written in her careful script, my name is Ayanna Morrison, and I want to tell you about the time when wolves dressed like men tried to destroy everything good in our territory, and how ordinary people who chose to love instead of hate stopped them. It started with a map hidden in a locket, and a broken warrior who chose to protect a frightened child instead of walking away from her pain. Outside her window, the prairie stretched endlessly under a canopy of stars, beautiful and peaceful, in a way that would have seemed impossible during the dark years when fear ruled the land. Somewhere in that vast expanse, new communities were taking root and growing, built on foundations of mutual respect rather than exploitation and violence. The world had indeed needed her strong, and Ayanna had not disappointed it. But more than that, she had learned that true strength came not from standing alone against adversity, but from building connections with others who shared her commitment to justice, compassion, and hope for a better future. In the years to come, she would help establish schools and hospitals, negotiate treaties, and settle disputes, raise children who would carry forward the lessons their parents had learned through struggle and sacrifice. The work would never be completely finished. There would always be new challenges, new injustices, new wolves in human clothing who needed to be confronted with courage and wisdom. But there would also always be people willing to stand up to them. People who understood that ordinary courage, guided by love and tempered by experience, could accomplish extraordinary things. The story that had begun in terror and loss had become something else entirely, a testament to the power of redemption and the strength of community and the unshakable truth that good people working together could overcome any evil that threatened their world. And in a territory where justice had triumphed over corruption, where different peoples had learned to live together in peace, where children of all backgrounds could grow up free from fear, that story would continue to inspire future generations long after its original participants had joined the spirits in the endless sky. The weight of tomorrow had become the promise of tomorrow, and that promise would endure as long as people remembered the lessons of courage, sacrifice, and love that had made it possible.